So there's so much going on. I don't know where to start. It's kind of overwhelming this last couple weeks. I guess perhaps maybe did you want to start with Archbishop Vigano? Because there's a lot to cover there. The last couple weeks with him.
Okay, of course, I think we'll speak about Archbishop Vigano in the context of the ongoing
Yes,
synod, which is
yes,
taking place in the Vatican at the present moment,
yes,
because this synod is, in fact, the most momentous event in church history uh, since even before the Arian heresy. In all the history of the church, this is now the most critical uh, event taking place in all church history, more so than the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, more so than the Arian heresy. This is the greatest crisis the church has ever undergone and probably ever will undergo.
right. Which is now Archbishop Vigano came out with this. I found this really interesting. He came out with he said, I would like us to take seriously, very seriously, the possibility that Bergoglio wanted to obtain the election through fraud and that he intended to abuse the authority of the Roman pontiff to do the exact contrary of what Jesus Christ gave the mandate to St. Peter and his successors to do. And then he goes on, but in the end, he says, wow, he kind of calls out his fellow brothers there in the church. He says, but how many of my brothers who also recognize the gravity of the current crisis have the ability to recognize this causal link between the conciliar revolution and its extreme consequences with Bergoglio? So, in other words, I mean, isn't he saying Vatican II or no?
Yes, of course, he's saying Vatican
Yeah,
II. And uh, that is what Cardinal Ratzinger revealed about the third secret of Fatima, that there would be this evil council. And he said a number of things uh, to uh, to his former professor, Dr. Ingo Dollinger. He said that in the council speaks of that the message speaks of the evil council, and Our Lady warned that they must not make changes in the Mass. The Mass must not be changed. They must not be adding extraneous elements into the Mass liturgy, which is exactly what Vatican II did. Vatican II ordered it to resolve this to be done. This was the mandate of the Second Vatican Council, signed by Pope Paul VI, which goes directly against the warning of Our Lady of Fatima in the Third Secret. And more importantly, it goes against the solemn profession ratified by the Council of Constance in Session 39. This is a papally ratified session of an ecumenical council. It's a very solemn and definitive statement that the traditional rite of liturgy, the traditional rite of Mass, the Pope is bound to the traditional rite of Mass, that he can't change it.
right.
The Pope can make revisions. Revisions of the liturgy have always been permitted, but it has to be within the framework, in the context of, as Pope Leo XIII taught, minor changes, mainly in the nature of a restoration. That the purity of the rite must be preserved, the substance and purity of the Roman rite, because it is the solemn rite of the Universal Church. It must be preserved, and it is untouchable. That cannot be changed. The Council Fathers of Vatican II made vaguely worded statements that would clearly imply that radical changes could be made in the liturgy. And the Concilium, authorized by Pope Paul VI to revise the Roman Rite, in fact, overthrew the Roman Rite and created an entirely new rite, a bogus rite, which is fraudulently called the Roman Rite, but it is not the Roman Rite. And we can say this with absolute certainty because the men who created the new rite themselves very explicitly stated that what they created, this new rite is not the Roman rite. Father Joseph Gelero, one of the chief architects of the new rite, said, "The Roman rite no longer exists. It has been destroyed." And he knows very well, because he was one of the principal parties involved in the destruction of it.
Right.
Archbishop Bunini spoke of the new mass as being a new creation, built on a new foundation, not just that is not just a revision.
Do
So
you
they violated the most solemn teaching of the church, that the Pope and the entire Roman Patriarchate, the Universal Church, under the jurisdiction of the Roman Patriarchate in Roman liturgical law, is bound by divine law to the traditional rite. In fact, even the Greek Church is bound by divine law to its traditional liturgy. This was solemnly defined by the Council of Florence. What is the customary rite? The church's customary rites are of divine law. So what the customs established by tradition are of divine law, and divine law statutes that they must be adhered to. So this is what Vatican II, this was the reason why Our Lady warned about this evil council, Vatican II.
and it seems like Archbishop Vigano is uh stating that now. He's stating this is where it began. This is where the problems began, and this is the
It began
culmination.
with Vatican II, and
Right.
where it is leading to, that's also stated in the third secret of Fatima. Cardinal Samuel Stritch went to Rome in 1957. In a little known meeting that took place, a group of cardinals and prelates met with Pope Pius XII in 1957. Pope Pius XII opened the secret in their presence and read the secret.
Wow.
This was not announced to the world. John the 23rd announced it to the world. That there was a press release about the opening of the secret. So the whole world knew that John the 23rd opened the secret. But there was an unsolved mystery for a time as to why there was an extra envelope there, sealed inside of another sealed, taped sealed envelope inside of a properly sealed envelope. And of course, the reason we now know from subsequent testimony that is because it wasn't opened for the first time by John the 23rd. Pius XII opened it, had to put back into the envelope. And Cardinal Stritch said he was under obligation not to reveal the contents of the secret, but he said some of it is so important that he felt he had to reveal some details of it. And this was in November of 1957. He was at a family reunion, and there was a large number of the extended family of which he was one. This was Father Hughes, Father Hughes, who had accompanied Cardinal Stritch, and Father Hughes at that family reunion in 1957, having accompanied Cardinal Stritch to Rome, having received the content of the secret from Cardinal Stritch directly. Father Hughes judged that it was necessary to reveal some of the more essential contents of the secret, to give warning to the people present what was going to be happening soon in the church. Now, he said, this is the context, we're in the context of 1957. He said, it's not today or tomorrow, but soon there is going to be a movement in the church to change the Mass, to change the liturgy of the Mass. He said, have nothing to do with it, because what they're going to do is incrementally, by stages, they're going to make reforms that will lead to the total abolition of the sacrifice of the Mass. And the ecumenical liturgy that is envisaged by Jorge Bergoglio and his gang of heretics, in order to create communion, full communion, a unity between the Roman Church and the Protestant churches. They want to have a common liturgy where there will be no restriction. Everyone can attend this liturgy without any restriction. It'll be full intercommunion, interfaith communion with the Protestants. And for that, they need a common liturgy. And the common liturgy, of course, will be something that is not a valid mass.
Right.
Because the Protestants do not accept the doctrine of the propitiatory oblation of the Holy Mass. They do not accept the dogma of the transubstantiation. The Protestant doctrine is that the Mass is a mere commemoration.
Right.
And that the bread and wine remain bread and wine. The Lutherans believe that Christ is present in the bread. The Calvinists believe that Christ is symbolized by the bread, but none of them profess the dogma of transubstantiation, which is that formulated and defined by the Council of Trent, that marvelous change whereby there is, from the substance of the bread and wine are changed into the substance of the body and blood of Christ, and only the appearance, the species of bread and wine remain. That is the Catholic dogma.
Right.
And they have to, in order to have unity with the Protestants, they have to reformulate the liturgy of the Mass so as to that the intention of the rite will not be to bring about the sacrifice that Jesus Christ instituted when he instituted the Mass at the Last Supper.
Right.
Or after, to be more precise, after the Last Supper.
Right. Driving the church into what they want, a one world religion where everyone's welcome. There's no Catholicism there in the end when he gets done with it, at his.
And that is what this what the synod is leading to. The synod is leading us in that direction. And again, as I've explained in my 2 volumes, especially regarding Jorge Bergoglio, in the introduction to Volume 1, and in the second part of Volume 2, where I have explained the agenda of Jorge Bergoglio, who calls himself Francis and Bishop of Rome. His agenda, of course, he has set forth, he has stated very plainly what he intends to do to the church. So I'm not making suppositions and speculations here.
Exactly.
He wants full communion between Catholicism and Protestantism. He wants unity, the unity of all religions. He wants communion of the Catholics with all the religions of the world. He said so much.
I know he did. That's true. I mean, he's not exactly been secretive about it. He's been fairly open that he's going to destroy it, or that's his intention anyway, as it stands.
Archbishop Vigano has said very clearly that he is in heresy.
Yeah.
And he has stated very clearly that his election to the papacy was not valid.
He's getting a lot of heat for that everywhere, which is a shame because it's true. I mean, he's telling the truth, but that's what happens when you tell the truth.
We know from what has been spoken of by those who have read the Third Secret of Fatima, and it is confirmed by the unanimous teaching of the ancient fathers of the church, that Rome will defect. Rome will defect not only into heresy, but into apostasy, into paganism.
Yeah, paganism.
The true pope, when he will be elected, the true pope will be driven out of Rome, and according to the prophecy of Pope Saint Pius X, not only will he be driven out of Rome, but he will be martyred. He will die a very cruel death. In the meantime, as Cardinal Henry Edward Manning explained already in 1861, that this defection of Rome, and that the church, the Catholic Church, will appear to have been swept off the face of the earth. It will appear that way because a counterfeit church is going to take the place of the Catholic Church. And this is so clearly set forth in Scripture, in tradition, and it's in the third secret of Fatima, that the Catholic people have to be prepared to understand that these reforms taking place in Rome are not reforms at all. It is a revolution that intends to reform the Catholic Church out of existence, because the synod is a synod and synodality. Now, what does that mean? Well, a synod and synodality is trying to reform the church, to make the church a synodal church. The problem with that is that the church is constituted by Jesus Christ as a monarchical church. The church is governed by the primacy of the Pope. The primacy of the Pope is a participation in the kingship of Jesus Christ. And because the Pope has a participation in the kingship of Jesus Christ, the church is established as a monarchy. And this is the truth of the Catholic faith. The church is established as a monarchy. The Pope has a jurisdiction which is defined solemnly by the First Vatican Council, a full and supreme jurisdiction consisting of a total fullness of supreme power. Now, this total fullness of supreme power, defined as a dogma of faith, excludes any possibility that there can be any synodal jurisdiction in the church that would in any manner subtract or diminish the total fullness of supreme power of the Pope. The Pope has what Pope Pius XII declared to be a full and absolute jurisdiction over the whole church. So there, it is the divine constitution of the church. The church is constituted by Jesus Christ, with the Pope having the full and total primacy over the whole church, a total fullness of supreme power that does not admit of any mitigation of that power by a synodal jurisdiction of the bishops. So the very concept of a synodal church is contrary to the divine constitution of the church. It is contrary to the faith. So if you would attempt to reconstitute the church as a synodal church, if someone claiming to be Pope would attempt to reconstitute the church synodally rather than with the absolute jurisdiction of primacy, he would not bring about the reform of the church and the constituting of the Catholic Church as a synodal church. What he would accomplish would be himself and all those prelates with him and all the faithful who are united with him in this endeavor, that they would all depart from the Catholic Church. They would defect from the faith. They would depart from the Catholic Church and cease to be Catholics, because they are creating a new Protestant denomination, a new Protestant sect.
Right.
So in order to be in communion with all the Protestants, what Bergoglio, who calls himself Francis, is doing is that he is creating a new Reformation Protestant sect to be in communion with the other Protestants. So he will be in communion, he and his hierarchy will be in communion with their fellow Protestants, but they will have left the Catholic Church. They will have defected from the Catholic Church. So that will be the great schism, the greatest schism of all time. And Jorge Bergoglio, who called himself Francis, he himself said some years ago that he may be the cause of a schism. And indeed, this synod is going to cause that schism, because he himself is creating the break with Catholicism.
Right.
Francis and his hierarchy are separating themselves from the Catholic Church. So in order to remain in the Catholic Church, we have to reject him and his reforms and remain in the one Catholic apostolic faith. That faith cannot be changed. There's going to be two churches. Which is the true church? Well, St. Robert Bellarmine gives us the answer, which is the perpetual teaching of the church, the perpetual dogma of the Catholic faith. He says the true church is the church that professes the faith of Christ. That is the traditional faith of Catholic dogma, the faith that we have received, handed down to us by the apostles and their successors, defined by the popes down through the ages. the unchangeable, irreformable Catholic faith. The dogmas of faith are solemnly and infallibly defined to be irreformable in and of themselves. Ex sese irreformabiles. So when they say that we have to adjust our thinking, that we have a new understanding of the dogmas, we have a deeper understanding of the dogmas, we have to reject that. That's heresy.
Right.
And that very idea was very solemnly condemned already by Pope Gregory XVI in his encyclical Mirari Vos. And again, after that, it was solemnly condemned by the First Vatican Council.
Yeah.
So
how do you respond to Bishop Athanasius Schneider's letter to, or statement, I guess, to the faithful, to recognize and resist Francis while still recognizing him as the Pope, but resisting him? I find that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Not in this situation. It really doesn't.
I've written an article based on some social media posts that I've written on precisely answering him. I've answered him also in the second volume of my book, on the True and the False Pope, the case against Bergoglio, explaining what is the basis, the root of his error, because he is claiming that the doctrine, which is in fact the doctrine of faith, it is a universal teaching. It is the universal teaching of the magisterium, acknowledged as such, testified to by great theologians such as John of St. Thomas, who said it is unanimous among the doctors of theology. It is unanimous that if the Pope is a heretic, he can be judged and removed. Now, because it's a unanimous teaching, that it fulfills the criteria of a dogma of the universal ordinary magisterium. The ordinary universal magisterium is, in its definitive teachings, is of divine and Catholic faith. These are definitions of faith of the universal magisterium. And that is one of them. That even if the Pope were to be a heretic, well, he's not a true Pope then. And this is what Ballerini...
Everybody says you can't, we as lay people, you as a priest, we have no authority to say that he is not the Pope, that we have to wait for future cardinals and bishops and whatnot in the church, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, maybe 100 years from now to decide that. But I mean,
that's a false doctrine.
Yeah,
that's a false doctrine, and that is proximate to heresy. In fact, it is strictly by strict implication, it is a heresy to say that, because the dogma of the universal ordinary magisterium has been clearly attested to. We have the unanimous teaching of theologians. We have the clear teaching of Pope Innocent III, upon which the theologians in later centuries based that entire teaching on the pronouncements of Pope Innocent III, who was not writing a book. He was preaching as the teacher, acting in his authentic magisterium as the Bishop of Rome. He was teaching on the very nature of the papacy. He was explaining why, and he said explicitly, the Pope cannot be judged by anyone, except, however, in matters of faith, if he were to fall into heresy, he can be judged, or more precisely, he can be shown to be already judged. And if that were to happen, he says, if the Pope were to wither away into heresy, then he is good for nothing but, and he quotes the scripture, the gospel, our Lord Jesus Christ. In that case, he would be good for nothing except like the salt that loses its savor, to be cast out and trampled underfoot by men. And he defines those terms. What does it mean to be cast out? He says deposed, to be trampled underfoot by men, to be excommunicated, to be despised by the Catholic faithful. And the foundation that he gives for this doctrine is that, in his own very explicit words, because the heretic is an alien. He is not part of the Catholic Church. The heretic is an alien. The heretic is an outsider. And he says a true pope, he says, cannot fall into heresy because he's protected by the grace, by the promise of Christ to St. Peter and his successors. The First Vatican Council, in its pronouncement, its definition of the dogma of infallibility, premised that infallibility on the promise of our Lord Jesus Christ. Basically, in order that the Pope would be able to strengthen the faith of his brethren, in order that the Pope can pronounce infallible dogmas, that he cannot fall into heresy, that the promise made by Christ is that the Pope cannot, his faith cannot fail, that this unfailing faith is passed on to his successors, the faith of the Pope cannot fail, in order that he will be enabled by divine grace to make infallible definitions. I've explained this at great length in my second volume and in my first volume, in both volumes. Pope Innocent III makes it very clear in his teaching that such a pope would not be a pope at all. If he's a heretic, he would not be a true pope, because he says that the true pope cannot become a heretic. And the greatest theologians, unanimously among the greatest of all theologians, they have unanimously held that a true pope, cannot fall into heresy. They treat of the question hypothetically: what if the Pope should become a heretic? Mm-hmm. St. Robert Bellarmine explains this, and Pietro Ballerini even more precisely explains that the canonical exception, these canons of the popes, these are rulings of the popes. The popes have issued rulings and teachings saying that if the Pope were to become a heretic, he can be judged by the Church, he can be cast out, he can be condemned, he can be deposed.
What do you say
and
to
the reason
people?
why it is given by Ballerini. Ballerini explains that this is not an attack on the Pope's primacy.
Okay.
Because if that were to happen, if it could happen, the Pope would lose his primacy. He would cease to be Pope, and therefore the man being judged would not be the Pope, but as Gregory XVI, Pope Gregory XVI mentions Ballerini by name and says, Pope Gregory XVI says that the Church would not be judging the Pope, but the man who formerly had been the Pope.
What do you think people are so afraid of? You know, Archbishop Vigano set out a statement for the Catholic Identity Conference here in Pittsburgh, which wasn't aired, I guess. I guess it was a last minute decision or something like that. But you know, they pulled out the boogeyman word, Sadie, the word everybody wants to run away from. I don't consider myself a Sadie because I don't believe Bergoglio is a valid pope. I mean, I've kind of stood with you on this right from 10 years ago. It just seemed very clear to me then. You were standing up even then by yourself. That was before anybody else was saying a word. And I'm sure you took a lot of heat for that too. But, you know, what is it with this terrible fear of, it's like when the leftists label someone a racist, Catholics bring out the word Sadie to shut you down. You know, you're a Sadie.
Yeah. The reaction is human respect. It's servile fear. It is a servile fear, which of course is a sin.
Yeah.
Now I have explained and demonstrated beyond all possible dispute that Catholics do not require any kind of authority or jurisdiction to simply understand a truth. To say that you don't have the authority to make this judgment about the Pope means, what kind of a judgment are we talking about? it's true that I don't have the jurisdiction. You don't have the jurisdiction. There is no authority for either one of us to make a pronouncement with juridical effect. We are not tribunals. I am not a tribunal. I don't have any ecclesiastical jurisdiction to pronounce a judgment against any bishop or pope or any priest or any Catholic. The only jurisdiction I have is in the confessional. That's where I have jurisdiction.
Right.
Outside of that, I have no jurisdiction. But the thing is this: we're not talking about a juridical judgment. We're not talking about a judgment of the church's judicial forum here. We're talking about a judgment of the mind, which is to understand something. And this is how stupid these people are, because essentially what they're saying is, I don't have the authority to judge. If you understand what is the definition of judgment in this context, we're talking about a judgment of the mind. What they're saying is, we don't have the authority to understand. We don't have the jurisdiction to understand and understand the truth, to recognize a fact, and to speak the truth. We don't need any authority. We have a God-given faculty of intellect that if we understand the truth, we have the right to speak the truth. And it is a judgment. It is a judgment which is a judgment of the human mind. It is a judgment of the intellect, because it is within our natural power to make this judgment. We don't need any extra authority. We don't need any judicial authority conferred upon us to make a judgment that we are naturally capable of making. God created us according to our nature to be able to make this judgment, and so we have the right. We have the right to make this judgment. We don't need a jurisdiction conferred upon us.
And a duty.
We don't need any jurisdiction or permission. We don't need a permission or a jurisdiction, an ecclesiastical faculty, to exercise the right, which is the right of our nature, to see, to think, and to come to a proper, correct understanding, and make the judgment of the mind when we can see the truth of the matter, and when it is proven beyond all reasonable doubt and beyond, in fact, beyond all rational possibility of doubt, that a man is a heretic, it is thereby proven that that man is an incapable subject to the papacy. Now, to show how stupid is this opinion that they're coming up with, how could they even have a synod of Rome or an ecumenical council? How could they convene and gather and to decide the question whether a man is a heretic or a pope if they're not even allowed to think about it? Because if we have to wait for a pronouncement to be made, until that pronouncement is made, no one, absolutely no one, even the bishops and the cardinals, would not have the moral right to even think about this question. If they didn't have.
Interesting. That's an interesting thought. That's true. You're right. That's ridiculous.
The judgment of the mind, the private individual's judgment of the mind, has to be made first. Then those who make the judgment of the mind gather together and they say, we have a problem on our hands. Those who have the authority to make a decision and to make a pronouncement, they are the ones, as St. Robert Bellarmine says, if in the course of a council it should be discovered that the Pope is in fact an infidel, that he's defected from the church and he's not the Pope, and they have the power to make this declaration. And this teaching has been taught not only by St. Robert Bellarmine, very clearly explained by Ballerini, and even more clearly and more briefly, succinctly explained by Pope Gregory XVI. And after the First Vatican Council, it became the common opinion among theologians, two things: that a true pope cannot become a heretic. Secondly, hypothetically, it's a hypothesis, hypothetically, if the Pope were to become a heretic, a public heretic, he would automatically lose office. And It was the Jesuit Father Sidney Smith who said in 1895 already that this is the common teaching of all theologians after Vatican I, and it was recognized as the common teaching of theologians after Vatican I because the definition on infallibility was premised, made possible. The charism of papal infallibility is made possible being premised on the grace that the Pope cannot lose his faith. He cannot fail in his faith. And unanimously, it is understood by the great theologians in the church down through history, ever since they began to really examine the question of infallibility, which in the Middle Ages, 11th, 12th, 13th century, they didn't speak too clearly about infallibility. But once they began to discuss infallibility and how our Lord's promise to St. Peter applies to this gift of infallibility conferred upon the Pope, all the great theologians are in unison saying that the words of Christ in this promise were spoken simpliciter, which is to say, they are meant simply and univocally that the faith of Peter and his successors, their personal faith cannot fail. And all of the theologians, all of the greatest theologians are unanimous on this point. And this was pointed out by one of the great theologians of the 17th century, Father Francesco Bordoni. And he names even those going back to the 1400s who are of this position. And since then, I have quoted Don Curzio Nitolia, who has also given a good list of all the quoting the work of Silveira, that all these great theologians are unanimous on this point, that a true pope cannot fall into heresy. So you have all these great theologians after the 1600s, and before the 1600s, they are cataloged also by Don Bordoni, by Father Bordoni. So it has been so unanimously held for so long that a true pope cannot become a heretic. Yet, if the man who is purportedly the pope, and even as Pope Paul IV, confirmed by St. Pius V, they ruled that if a man is universally accepted as the pope by the whole church, but if it is later found that he's a heretic, his election is not valid. He is not the pope.
There you go. And that's one of the arguments. So many people try to shut you down and say, no, he's universally accepted, therefore he is. But that is so juvenile, because there's so much more to this situation. And then, of course, Archbishop points out,
they're expanding this teaching, extending it beyond its proper parameters, because that doctrine is true within its given parameters. Mm-hmm. If a man who was valid matter to be pope is elected, and his election is not valid, it will be validated later on by universal acceptance. That is true.
Correct. Yeah.
But if a person is elected pope, a person who is incapable of being pope is elected, universal acceptance will not rectify, and validate the election. For example, if a newborn infant, if a lunatic, a totally insane person, if a woman, or if an infidel or heretic, schismatic, who are outside the church, would be elected a pope, they are invalid matter. They are not capable of being validly elected. So even if one would be apparently validly elected, that all the formalities of law were observed, but if it were later to be found out that this person is not even capable of being pope, like the legend, and it's only a legend, the legend of Pope Joan. Of course, if there ever had been such a person, she would be incapable of being pope because she's a female. Such a one, even validly elected, could not be pope. If the Dalai Lama were to be elected pope, and if he were in an ecumenical synodal church, if they were to elect a pagan, a Buddhist, a Taoist, if they were to elect a Hindu to be pope, that person would not be pope, because, to use the terminology of the saints, of the doctors of the church, Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and the other great theologians and doctors, Father Francesco Bortoni, and Saint Robert Bellarmine, they are an incapable subject to the papacy. So universal acceptance does not apply to people who are not even capable of being pope. It has to be one who's capable of being pope. Number one, the person has to be capable of being pope. If he's universally accepted, then he's the pope. Even if there's some canonical irregularity with the election. The argument was made that Pope Martin V was not canonically elected. Well, he was not elected according to the conclave laws, but it was not possible for the conclave laws to be applied. And Pope Gregory XVI explains that when there's such a situation, that the church is no longer governed by pontifical law, but aristocratically, in other words, that would be by a council, by the bishops acting as princes of the church. That's the aristocracy of the bishops, as the princes of the church. They would have the power to elect a pope when the monarchical rule has completely broken down and is no longer possible to apply it to the election of a pope. That's what the Council of Constance did to elect Pope Martin V. So even if there's a doubt about the validity of his election, he was universally accepted by the whole church, and therefore the church has recognized him as a valid pope, and he's the one who ended the Great Western Schism by that means. So even if an election is not valid according to all the prescriptions of law, it can be validated in that manner, but only if the person is capable of being a pope.
Yes.
It doesn't make a heretic, a lunatic, a woman, or a baby pope. They can't be pope. They're not capable of being pope. And secondly, if the see of Rome is impeded, if a pope has ambiguously renounced if the Pope has ambiguously renounced his ministry, leaving the question as to the validity of that act, if in fact the renunciation did not vacate the See of Peter, even if the Pope believed that he was vacating the See of Peter, that's only an effect of the act. If the formal object, the moral object formally of that act is not the renouncing of the Petrine Munus, then even if the Pope thinks that in renouncing his ministry, he would lose his munus and lose his jurisdiction, he would not.
Right.
In such a case, if there is a man still occupying the See of Peter, but he goes into retirement, you have what is called a sede impedita. The See of Peter is not vacant, it's impeded. In such a case, just like electing a heretic, just like electing a lunatic, or a baby, or a woman, the election would not be valid, because even if the newly elected man is universally accepted, he is incapable of becoming pope for so long as the see is occupied. As long as the papal chair is occupied by a valid pope, anyone else on earth is incapable of becoming a pope. So it all boils down to that one principle, that a person who is not capable of becoming pope, whether because it's the person himself, like the lunatic, or whether it is even a person who is very otherwise in his nature capable of being pope, a person who is baptized, who is a bishop, who is unquestionably orthodox in his Catholic faith, he is incapable of becoming pope for so long as the chair of Peter is occupied by a valid pope. So even if that one would be universally accepted, that principle of universal acceptance does not apply in those cases. One who in his nature is incapable of being pope, or one who, due to the circumstance that the see is occupied, in that case also, he would be incapable under those circumstances of becoming a valid pope, and therefore there would not be the sanatio in radice, there would not be the validation of an election under such circumstances.